All right, welcome back everyone to the University of Idaho and University of Wyoming Extension Sheep and Goat webinar series. We bring you this webinar once a week on Thursdays. And if you want to follow us on Facebook at UI Sheep and Goats or at UW Sheep, you can find information and events coming up to keep you guys up to speed. You can also watch all of these webinars on our YouTube channel, University of Idaho Extension Livestock channel. We post all of the webinars there once they've been completed live. Today we have Rebecca Kern back from Ward Laboratories, and she's going to visit with us about analyzing hay for winter feeding. And I'm going to follow up at the end and refresh you guys on how to use the information that you can get from her to balance some rations for your animals for the winter. So welcome, Rebecca, and I'll let you go ahead and get started.
All right, thanks, Melinda. Okay, so we'll just jump right into it. So we're going to talk about hay sampling for sheep and goats, and at the end we're going to look at some sample reports that we're going to gear our interpretation for flushing and then gestation, as I think many of you are probably hitting that point in the year. And then we're going to talk about some supplemental feeds and how to properly sample those, and Melinda, of course, is going to tie it all together. So for any of you guys who already listened to the pasture sampling webinar that I did here with Melinda, please bear with me. I know some of this is repetitive. For those of you that did not, if you want to dig deeper, check that out, or just ask a question here on the chat for at the end. Okay, so first of all, I actually tried to cut this table out because it's a little, I like to take some time on it. It's a little time consuming, but I just couldn't bring myself to do it. So on the top here, what we have is we've got crude protein, acid detergent fiber, and neutral detergent fiber. And the total digestible nutrients, those are the things we're going to focus on. On the left of this table, we have all these different forage crops. So you'll see here in the footnote, all of these were cut either at the boot stage if they're grasses or bud stage as legumes. So they're cut at the optimal time. And what you can see, I know many of you guys, Melinda put up that question asking what you guys plan to feed, and alfalfa and grass were the two that came up. So those are the first two forages up here. Got alfalfa. You can see if it was cut at the optimal time. We've got a crude protein of 22 to 26%, and that's a range when it was optimally cut. We have a range for our acid detergent fiber, our neutral detergent fiber, and our TDN. So the same goes for grass hay. We have a bit of a larger range here, 10 to 18%. Our acid detergent fiber and our neutral detergent fiber, 20% difference. That's pretty large, and that's really going to impact the total digestible nutrients or the energy that's contained in that forage. So remembering that all of these were cut at the optimal time, what do we think that gap is going to do, that variation, when we look at the real world scenarios where weather impacts things and we might not be able to get out there and cut and harvest and bale at the correct times that we would like to? It only increases the variability. And so me working in the lab, reviewing lab samples, I will tell you that grass hay could be as low as 4%. Or the alfalfa could be as low as 12% crude protein. The TDN, you're definitely going to be straddling the line where you may or may not be reaching that animal's nutrient requirements. And because of this, it's going to be important to feed. So to drive that home just a little bit further, we're going to look at this chart here, which as we move from left to right, the plant is maturing. And you can see that the plant maturity is going to really have an impact on the crude protein level as well as the fiber level, which is going to impact the amount of energy available in that forage. Most of us are going to try to harvest that hay to be put up for the winter for feeding right at this optimal level where we can optimize crude protein to meet animal requirements as well as yield so that we can have enough feed to get through the winter. However, we're planning on this as our cutting date, but a big rainstorm blows in. We might not get to cut until we're out here. And this is why we're going to need to analyze our forages to see what's really going on as far as nutrient content and the characteristics of those forages and how we need to be considering that as we're feeding out any ruminant animal. Okay, this is another duplicate slide from my pasture sampling webinar, but I do want to draw your attention to some different parts of this. So first of all, let's talk about weather patterns from a haying perspective. Drought, humidity, flooding. So humidity, what I typically see, I'm located in Nebraska. My guys on eastern Nebraska, they're down there closer to the Missouri River. They have a little bit more humid climate. And so a lot of times they think that they've done a great job of putting up hay and it comes back at a lower quality, a lower TDN than what they're used to. And that's because of that humidity. It means the dew's sitting on those forages longer as they're out there trying to dry. And so the soluble carbohydrates and the soluble proteins are actually leaving the forage after it's been cut, leaving it with an unexpectedly low value. So you guys are in Idaho. I lived in Eastern Washington in Pullman when I was a kid, and I remember it gets very hot and humid, and that's during haying season. And so considering what the weather's doing, what the humidity is like, what's the rainfall, what are the temperatures like, all of these things are going to impact what's going on with those forages when they're harvested. Furthermore, speaking specifically to hay, when it's baled, the baling conditions. So rained on hay is going to have a lot of the same issues that hay that's harvested and windrowed in humid conditions, that rained on conditions. Again, you're going to see an increase in the fibers because those water soluble nutrients are basically leached out of the plant as it's drying. And then a huge one when we're going into winter feeding is going to be storage. If you're leaving your bales out and it's exposed to the elements, the wind, the snow, the precipitation, all of that is going to decrease your forage's value. It's going to lose those water-soluble carbohydrates that I was talking about, which means we're going to have an increase in fibers. And so proper storage is going to be key. If you're able to store them, whether it be covering it with a tarp, if you have a really nice place, a barn or a hay shed, then you'll probably be able to sample your forage that you've either put up or that you're going to buy. And you're going to be able to use that report through the year and be very confident that it's accurate. If you don't have good storage facilities, your forage is going to be deteriorating, your hay is deteriorating, and you're going to need to resample before you feed, or else going off that former report, you may end up underfeeding animals because you don't think you need to supplement as much as you actually do. Okay. So we've talked about the importance of forage analysis. We know forages are variable. This is why we need to sample our hay before we feed it for the winter or before we put it up for the winter. And so taking a representative hay sample is going to be very, very important. That's why a representative sample for anything, that's why this word is so bolded and highlighted and underlined, because you want that to represent the feed that you're feeding. So your sample needs to represent the forage and the hays that you've put up, and then we take a representative lab sample to represent the representative sample you sent to us. And if it doesn't, you're either over or underestimating your forages. And that's going to affect how much you need to be supplementing or not supplementing and whether or not that animal is getting those nutrients. So I'm going to walk you through the recommended principles for proper hay sampling. This document is found on the National Forage Testing Association's website, which is just foragetesting.org. You can go there, you can become a certified hay sampler yourself. So first you need to identify a single lot of feed. So what is a lot of feed? A lot of feed is some hay that's been cut and is the same field of the same species all at one time. So if I have a field of alfalfa and I have a field of prairie hay and I cut them both at the same time, I still want to keep those two lots separate. If I have a field of alfalfa and I also have another field of alfalfa, but I cut them at different times, those still need to be two separate lots of hay, okay? Secondly, sample as close to feeding or as close to sale as possible, whether you're buying your forages or it's feeding out. Like I said, if you do a very good job storing, you can save yourself from having to sample before you feed out if you've done your sampling when you put it up and you do a good job of keeping that forage protected from the elements. Third, use a hay probe. Do not sample with your hands. When you sample with your hands, then the small fine particles in the forage is going to, especially when we're talking about alfalfa, which I know many of you probably use, those fine particles are going to be lost through your fingers. And so it's really important to use a hay probe and to probe the center of the bale, not the top part, not the bottom part, because those fine particles, they do tend to drift towards the bottom. So if you've sampled the bottom of your bale, you're going to overrepresent those fine particles, which means you're going to overrepresent the amount of protein that's in your forage, as well as the amount of energy that's in your forage. And then conversely, if you're sampling from the top portion of your bale, you're going to be overrepresenting your fibers, underrepresenting your protein, and underrepresenting the amount of energy that's actually in that bale, and then how much protein and energy supplements that's required. Okay? So then the next thing, when I speak with customers all the time, they're asking me, how many different bales do I need to sample? And so the first part of that question is sample at random. So don't choose a bale that's really green and looks really good and only sample those bales. But also don't choose the bales that one's at the bottom, it doesn't look very good. You need to sample all the bales randomly and choose the bales you're going to sample randomly, and sample approximately 20% of the bales. So if you have 100 bales in your lot, you should be taking 20 cores, combining those cores in a Ziploc bag and sending that to the lab. Why do I need to sample 20 cores? So the number that I usually hear when I speak with producers is, well, I did take multiple cores, I took about 5. Okay, 5 is not enough. So here, this again comes from foragetesting.org, from that great article written by Dan Putnam. So he took 20 cores, sampled them separately, and then here we've got their TDN, their total digestible nutrients, how much energy is actually in each of those cores. So you can see by looking at this, there's a lot of variation, even within one lot of hay. And that's why you need it to represent the forage that you're going to be feeding out over time, and you need to be meeting their nutrient requirements over time. So if we choose core 5, core 9 and 10, core 12 and 15, we've done our 5 cores, we think we've done a great job. But in fact, we have shorted ourselves because we are underrepresenting the amount of energy. We're going to end up over supplementing energy, and we're going to end up with fat animals. Conversely, if we chose these 3 bales and this bale and this bale, we would overestimate the amount of energy that's in our forage, and we would under supplement those animals, and we wouldn't understand why they're skinny. And so it's really important to take a representative sample so that your sample actually reflects how animals are going to perform when fed that forage. Okay. So I already covered sampling from the center of the bale, place your sample in Ziploc bags. So that's, again, stolen from the pasture sampling, just to get you an idea of, this is a quart-sized Ziploc bag is what we request, and many labs do. So now let's get into the meat and potatoes for you guys as sheep and goat producers, and let's talk about interpreting the hay reports. So unfortunately, I only pulled samples for sheep. I haven't pulled anything specific for goats, but the same principles are going to apply. Okay, so what I have here is a table, and today what we're going to focus in on is, what is this use requirement during flushing, as well as during the first portion of gestation, because we're going into winter time, and that's what we're going to be focusing on, is what are her nutrient needs during these times. So the first sample report we're going to go over is, this is a 4th cutting alfalfa. You can see we ran NIR. Ward Laboratories is an active member of the Near Infrared Forage and Feed Testing Consortium. And we also participate in proficiency programs. So I know that all these numbers are teeny tiny, and don't worry, I'm not expecting you to see those. We are going to look at this table where I've pulled out those numbers for you. So what we have going across, we have different nutrients, and then we've got the forage content, the requirement of that ewe at flushing, and the requirement of that ewe at early gestation. So first thing we're going to look at here is the energy in the feed, the total digestible nutrients. How much total digestible nutrients is in this alfalfa forage? So when I'm looking at that flushing ewe, I have a yellow flag come up, because while we are just trying to increase her nutrition so that she can reproduce more efficiently, it's pretty darn close. It's not too far off. Just a tiny little bit of energy supplementation may be required here. But for the early gestation, that meets her requirements. Excellent. Now let's move on and look at her crude protein requirements. So what we see here, this forage has 23.1% crude protein, and that's well above her crude protein requirements, whether she's in flushing or early gestation. So for me, that throws up a yellow flag. I need to consider this. So I look at the fibers, and I see that these are very low fiber concentrations, leading me to examine my non-fiber carbohydrates. And I can see that these are very high. Over 20% in a forage is quite high. And so what I do know is that any ruminant animal is going to be prone to bloating on this forage. So with that 20% crude, 23.1% crude protein and 26.9% non-fiber carbohydrates, that's going to hit the rumen. Those rumen microbes are going to go bonkers. They're going to be making so many byproducts, so much gas, it's going to just be getting stuck in this slime. And so we're going to have a frothy rumen pasture bloat. So we need to practice some caution when we're feeding alfalfa. This probably was not a first cutting. So we need to be practicing some caution with that. And we need to be analyzing our forage and knowing when we're going to be at risk of bloat. So we know that this needs to be mixed with a more fibrous forage that has less sugars, a little bit less carbohydrate or protein there for available to the rumen microbes. So I just want to draw your attention and share with you the book value of these nutrients in each of these forages. So right now we're looking at this alfalfa hay, and you can see the TDN has quite a range, which may or may not be meeting requirements. Crude protein is almost certainly going to be exceeding requirements. It's just a matter of by how much. And then you can see that the fibers are very variable, especially this neutral detergent fiber. And that's going to play a role because we know as our soluble sugars are lost, think of it as a cup of, or like a pie chart. As those are lost, we're losing sugars. So that portion of the pie chart gets smaller, but we're gaining our fibers, so that part gets bigger. Okay, so now let's take a look at grass. So again, we've got our flushing requirements and our early gestation requirements and our nutrients here across the top. First thing, let's look at the energy requirements or energy content of the forage compared to the requirements of our animal. We are not meeting energy requirements for flushing, so we are going to definitely be needing to supplement that. We are, however, right on the nose with the early gestating ewe. So now let's take a look at our protein, 6.4% crude protein. So we know that's not going to be meeting requirements. And when we're looking at that 6.4, so that's basically 3 percentage points off of 9. So about a third of her protein that she needs is missing. So we are definitely going to be needing to do some protein supplementation there. So then I look at these fibers, 41.6% and 72.8. That is quite high for a neutral detergent fiber. And so I'm not only concerned now about protein, but even when I'm feeding this early gestating ewe, is she going to be able to consume enough of this to get that total digestible nutrient requirement that she has, not on a percentage basis, because we can see on a percentage basis it will be met, but rather on a pounds per day basis. And so gut fill may be an issue because as the neutral detergent fiber increases, that means that it takes longer for them to ruminate, longer for that forage to be in the rumen, decreasing the passage rate, meaning that they can't consume enough physically to actually meet their requirements. Okay, and so in that case, I look at my digestibility of the neutral detergent fiber as well, and that's 54, and that's probably just average. So there's not, if this number was much higher, around 70, somewhere around like 68, I might be a little less concerned about this high neutral detergent fiber, but since it's not, then I'm concerned. I need to be definitely supplementing with some energy and certainly protein. Okay, and then again, let's have a look at these book value ranges. So the grass hay, again, quite variable in whether it may or may not be meeting those total digestible nutrient requirements. Similar with crude protein, and we can see we have quite a larger range for crude protein when we're just talking about grass hay. And then I did want to throw up lignin and just let you know, so if some of you guys are working with a sorghum Sudan grass, and that is not what's considered a grass hay here for the NRC, but if you were and you're considering these low lignin varieties, just understand the high lignin is associated with the fiber portion of the feed. So the higher the lignin, the higher the neutral detergent fiber typically. And so a low lignin would be 4%, 6 would be average, and higher than that is going to be having a huge detrimental effect on the digestibility of the neutral detergent fiber. Okay, so we've talked about the importance of analyzing our forages. We understand they're variable. We know how important it is to get a good representative sample so that we have a good forage report to go off of, and we are confident in the decisions we're making when feeding our sheep and goats. And then we've talked about how to interpret that report, comparing our numbers to animal requirements, and also looking at further constituents to see what physical characteristics of the forage are going to be impacting how these animals are consuming it. So now let's look at some supplemental feeds. Okay, so protein and energy supplements, that's what we're focusing on today. We're not getting into the nitty-gritty of minerals. So I'm just going to go through some of this with you guys. So my understanding from talking to Melinda is that a lot of you guys don't have these kinds of feeds readily available to just buy in bulk. But what you do have is the premixed. So I'm going to go through some of the considerations with these, and then we'll talk a little bit about the premixed formulas that you guys do have. I just want you to be thinking about these things. If you do have a way to obtain some of these, they might be a more economical option for you rather than going to the feed store and buying it by bag. Okay, so first let's talk about corn grain. So corn grain is going to be excellent choice if we are really looking for energy. All that starch provides tons of energy. The crude protein, however, is a bit lower. Some considerations we want to consider: high moisture corn typically is more digestible and more readily available to those rumen microbes. And so high moisture corn is going to give us a little bit more of a boost in energy than our typical number 2 dried corn. And then processing, of course, is going to increase our surface area and allow those rumen microbes to really go in and break down that starch and make use and utilize that energy. Furthermore, I don't know these Inogen varieties. I don't know if those are common for you guys in Idaho. They're starting to be more and more common around here to be feeding to cattle. We know that Inogen has the amylase in the corn, and it actually doesn't get activated until it's past the rumen, which is a good thing. And it has been shown in different studies that I have read to increase the efficiency of the feed utilization for that corn. So then my minimum recommended analysis, we do have a NIR calibration for corn grain that was made specifically for Ward Laboratories. So you can run that, or you can get an understanding of your protein and your energy values by running our F2 test. So some other small grains, the wheat and oat, again, great for energy supplementation, better than corn for protein. Processing is going to be a consideration that you're going to want to think about when you are obtaining these feeds for a supplement. And then again, I would just recommend the wet chemistry F2 test on these. I'm going to talk a little bit more in depth here about the dried distillers grains plus solubles. They're readily available here in Nebraska. We're surrounded by all these ethanol plants. It may or may not be readily available for you guys. I should caveat that it was readily available prior to COVID, but hopefully that's not going to be something that lasts too much longer. So it's very, very high energy. And in fact, typically I get the feedback from my customers that, hey, guys' equations, what I was getting, your guys' equations aren't quite reflecting my animal's performance. My animal are actually performing better. And so we've actually adjusted this. So I'd say this 95 is actually closer to 105 on the high end range for percent total digestible nutrients. So it's a really good way to get some energy into animals. Furthermore, really a lot of crude protein in this, but there are a lot of nutritional considerations that you certainly want to get a feed report. And it's not that you need to get a feed report all the time, but every time you get a new batch, you definitely need to know what's in that batch. So distillers, sulfuric acid is used in that process in the ethanol plants. And so distillers co-products notoriously have high sulfur, so you can run into some PEM issues. Also, phosphorus has been concentrated from what's in the corn grain to what's in that byproduct. And so you guys, especially if you have rams, you're going to need to consider that, as you may end up with some water belly issues when that phosphorus and magnesium and calcium balances aren't quite right. And then sometimes copper can be an issue. So I would definitely recommend that you maybe test it before you base your entire feeding plan around it, especially sheep guys. Goat guys, probably not as big of a deal. And then fat content. So the fat extraction in the ethanol plants is the most variable part for this feed. And so you're definitely going to want to test your fat every time. If you're overfeeding these, the fat might start to inhibit the fiber digestion in the rumen. And it's also the most variable because some plants are extracting more than others. Some plants are more efficient at extracting it and selling it for corn. oil than others. So that's definitely something you want to consider. So for that feed, I recommend our F10 test, which is going to include all of our wet chemistry, includes the dry matter, protein, ADF, fat, minerals, and of course your calculated energy value, which is going to be your TDN. Okay, and then finally, I've seen a spike in using the soybean meal with the low supply of distillers that we've seen with COVID. So there's 3 different kinds that you could potentially obtain: high protein, low protein, and extruded. Again, all great sources of energy, really good for protein. You really don't have to feed a lot of it, but there are some nutritional factors to consider. Protease inhibitors that get in the rumen and they can inhibit the enzymes that are responsible for breaking down and utilizing that protein. And so it's going to be important to test for that. An indicator would be urease activity, which is checked by this soy check assay that we can do here in our lab. And so this is why it's really important to make sure that that soybean meal was actually heated to the proper level to where it actually, excuse me, to where it actually kills those enzymes and doesn't make them active, but it also can go too far where it's overheated and that can result in heat damage. And again, these also have variable content, with those high protein having the least amount of fat. Oh, excuse me, did I say protein? I meant fat. Okay, so for that, I recommend dry matter, protein, ADF. I do recommend to do the soy check once in a while, fat, and then of course your calculated total digestible nutrient values. So now let's talk about these pre-mixed feeds. So I just went online. I did not go down to our local feed store. I should have, because I couldn't find anything specifically formulated for flushing or gestating sheep and goats. So I found a lot of these. So when you're looking at these, you've got your protein, you've got your fat, you've got your fiber. And there are equations you can look up and you can, I would say estimate, because I'm not a fan of the crude fiber measurement, your TDN on these. So you could do that. It's also going to be important to look at your ingredients, grain products, roughage products. So we're not really sure what's in here. I'm sorry about that, guys. Okay, so a sheep and goat grower, same thing. Finisher and a lactating tag I found. I didn't find one specific for flushing or for gestating, but I would recommend, while these have the minimum values on it, if you wanted to go ahead and test those, you could run the F10 test. I think would be the most applicable, because then you'd really get an idea of everything that's going on in those. And the minerals, if this is being used as your protein and energy supplement, it obviously has minerals, and you're going to want to make sure that that plays well with your mineral supplement that you've chosen. Okay, so how do we sample these? So whether you're talking about your small grains and your corn grain and your soybean meal, your distillers, it doesn't matter. All of those are less variable than your forages are going to be. So you don't have to take a full 20%, but I would say a minimum take 10 subsamples. Use a scoop or a cup for the same reasons as we want to use a probe with hay sampling. We don't want to lose those fine materials. Mix those subsamples together and then send the lab a quart size or a sandwich size Ziploc bag. And then Melinda can help you to balance your rations with using all of that. So with that, that's the end. I talked way more than I had planned or practiced. So hopefully if you guys have questions, we have time.
Yeah, go ahead and leave that up for a sec so people can get your information if they want it. You do have a question about your opinion on soybean hull pellets.
Okay, so those would be, so soy hulls, obviously they are much higher in fiber than the soybean meal that I'm talking about. So they're higher in fiber. I think they still have pretty decent energy to them and decent protein. And if they've been pelletized, obviously that's for ease of handling. And that's also going to mean that they were probably heated. So you probably don't need to be concerned with the urease activity or the trypsin inhibitors. I would say definitely analyze them, and I can walk you through that, how to interpret that report for based on those. But they are something that I see more often with feed meal mixed, for probably more for pigs and poultry. I see being fed that more than ruminants, I would say.
Okay, so we're gonna try to pull together the information that you guys can get when you have your feeds analyzed, and put them in an application to your animals. So one of the things I just wanna make sure that we're all remembering is keeping an eye on body condition scores throughout the year, but especially in the winter, because as you know, especially with your sheep, we have a lot of wool coming on in winter, and it's really difficult sometimes to maintain a good understanding of where we are with body condition. So one of the things that you really should do as the winter goes along is maybe every couple of weeks or once a month, get your hands on some of your animals and make sure that you can feel how thin they may or may not be getting. So if you have animals in midwinter and mid-gestation that are hitting this condition 1 or condition 2, where you're having the spine protruding pretty prominently, and we're feeling and or seeing that transverse process sticking out, you really need to try to avoid getting to this point to start with. And I can tell you right now that if you analyze your feeds and you make a plan and you balance a ration right now, as we're going into winter, you're going to be a lot happier maintaining a good body condition than trying to bring them back from being really thin. It's very difficult to make an animal gain weight while they're not only pregnant, but also going through winter. It's just a really difficult time to be trying to add weight. So make sure your animals this fall are coming into this body condition 3 and maintaining that throughout the winter. The other thing to consider is it's really also pretty easy with sheep and goats to overfeed them. And if they get into this, especially a body condition 5, but even coming between the 4 and the 5, your animals are too overweight, and you're going to see some issues, especially during kidding and lambing. They may not be able to finish their gestation, and they probably won't be able to provide good milk for those lambs. So a body condition unit is approximately a 13% change in their body weight. So for example, if you have a 150-pound animal, one body condition is going to be approximately 20 pounds. So it's really important to get a feel for, if you can get in underneath the wool and feel their body condition and make sure that you're just staying right on top of it, that will help you make changes or know where you're at as far as whether you need to supplement more or maybe supplement a little less. I think one of the things that we run into with sheep and goats is oftentimes we feel like they need more energy when really the problem is that they need more protein and less energy. So it's just really important to make sure you're watching your animal condition and responding to that. So making sure as you go into the winter that you understand what your animal body condition should actually be throughout the year. Last spring when we were lambing and kidding, these animals should have been looking pretty good. And as they have those lambs and kids, their body condition is going to drop, and they'll continue to lose a little bit of weight because it takes a lot of nutrients to provide milk for lambs. So if we're talking this line being approximately a 3 body condition, you're going to see a fluctuation here from 4 down to maybe when we're weaning off, these animals could be 2.5, right? And that's perfectly acceptable. But you have to make sure that they gain that weight back because they need to be at about that 3 body condition score at breeding to make sure that you're having the most success during your breeding program. And then as we move forward, the animals will be gaining weight because they are making lambs and kids, right? So the biggest thing to keep track of here is they need to be gaining weight, but not losing body condition, if that makes sense. You don't want to see your ewes and does dropping body weight during gestation because that's a lot more serious than it seems like it is if you're just looking at body weight. So make sure that as you come into lambing, they need to be at least a 2.5 body condition, if not a 3. And then during that dry period, you need to get them back up to that 3 for good breeding. So again, we talked about you don't want to have anything less than a 2, especially during gestating and lambing and kidding. And you also have to be careful when they're too thin or too fat of issues related to pregnancy toxemia, which we've talked about in other webinars, so I won't go into too much detail on that. But again, gain is so much more expensive than just maintaining. And so really in these summer periods, right after we get these lambs weaned off, we really need to make sure they're looking good going into the winter. So Rebecca already touched on some of this, but it's important to understand that during different stages of the life cycle of the animals, they're going to require different amounts of feed. And so one of the things that's really important to remember is if an animal is only going to eat 3 pounds a day, you cannot make her eat more just because she needs to meet requirements, right? You have to make your requirements fit within the amount that she's going to be willing to eat. So for example, a 160-pound ewe, she's going to eat almost 3 pounds a day. But then as she starts going through breeding and gestation, she's going to start eating more to be able to feed that fetus and to make milk. So she's going to be more willing to eat more feed to meet those requirements because there's just more being used during that time period. But it's also a matter of the stage of life that the animals are in too. So if you have a ewe lamb, she's going to require more than a mature ewe because she's also growing in addition to all the other things that you're asking of her. So it's really important to make sure that you know how much she's going to be willing to eat and then be able to balance what you're feeding them within that premise. So this is also probably looking familiar to a talk I gave in April about nutrition. I just want to make sure you guys have this reminder, and it's going to just build on what Rebecca was talking about. So again, fill is the limiting factor. So if you have this ewe during different phases of her gestation and her life stages, and then you're going to feed her some pretty low quality brome hay, and I'm not going to go through these calculations because that's just math that we don't have to do, but I will show you how to find these answers in a minute. So if she's going to eat 4.5 to 5 pounds a day, then we calculate that that is not going to be enough. If we feed her 5 pounds a day, it's not going to be enough if she has a set of triplets, right? During late gestation, if she's raising 1 lamb or 2 lambs, this is going to meet her requirements from a crude protein standpoint as well as a TDN standpoint. But if you start having 3 or more lambs or kids and you start feeding milk after lambing or kidding, this brome hay is not going to meet requirements. And so that's one of the things that you have to make sure that you're that this is the reason why you need to have your hays tested so that you have a good understanding of, am I feeding what they actually need? Because if this is all you're feeding to your animals, come lambing and kidding, they're going to drop a lot of weight you can see that they are just not meeting requirements, and you're going to see a big drop off, and you're probably also not going to see a good amount of growth happening in your kids and lambs at that time either. Okay, I'm going to skip through this part. So I wanted to talk about this just briefly because I think it's really important to keep your head wrapped around it. As Rebecca said, when you get your analysis back, you're going to have it on a dry matter basis. And the reason that it's important to make these considerations is that all of the nutrients are part of the dry pieces of your forage, of your feeds. But you have to feed them the whole thing. So, for example, if this is 100% of the feed that we're looking at, and the dry matter basis is 50%, that means that that feed is 50% water. So when you're talking about crude protein, you're talking about 15% of this 50 rather than of the whole 100. But when you go back after you look at these values, you're also having to feed that extra 50%. So that's where the fill is going to limit what you're able to feed the animals. So it's just something to consider. So now you know how much your animals are going to eat. You have your feed analyzed. Here's where everybody has a hard time for the most part, right? But there's a ton of tools out there that can help you balance the ration. It'll help you know throughout the time frame of your feeding, winter feeding, how nutrient requirements are going to change for your animals and how you need to change how much you're feeding of each type of feed. So there's a number of different options out there that you can use. Some of them you pay for, some of them are free for sheep and for goats. The one that I'm going to show you, I've already talked to you guys about at one point in time in April, I believe, but I'm going to go back through it so that I can hopefully help you guys know better how to use it. So let me stop my sharing, and I'm going to share this page. Hopefully you guys can see my web browser here. So I have the Montana State University Sheep Ration Program pulled up here. So there's a number of things that you can do. And I'm going to use the example that Rebecca gave us earlier. So you go up here to feeds. You can enter a custom feed. So this is where you get your feed back from Ward Laboratories or wherever you send it, and you can enter it straight into this program. So for this example, I'm going to put the alfalfa that she talked about. So that specific one, you had 85% dry matter. And then she showed you two columns. So the first column showed you the dry matter, and then the second column showed you all of the things on a dry matter basis. So then you go over there, you find the TDN value, which was 58 for that one. The crude protein was 23 for that one. These didn't come in the analysis, so you can just skip those. She did have some values for calcium, potassium, magnesium, 2, 4, and phosphorus. So you can save that example or save that feed. And now you can go over to balance, and you can balance a diet ration. So this is where you can find ones that you've already saved and you can look back, or you can create a new example. So let's say we're going to have a ewe that's in mid-gestation. She's 176 pounds approximately. You can find the alfalfa that we just inputted and add it to your feeds. And I also added the grass sample that she shared with us. But let's look at this one. Oh, sorry, alfalfa. So it inputs it here right at the bottom. So this tells you the crude protein based on how much you're feeding. And then here at the bottom, it tells you the percent of requirements that you're feeding. So if she requires this 3.3 pounds per day, that's how much she's going to be willing to eat. We can edit this value to match and save that. And so now you can see that we're meeting her requirements for intake by 100%. We're meeting her protein requirements by 245%. We're meeting her TDN by 100%. And then you can see the different values for the minerals that you got back on the analysis as well. So you can see that calcium and potassium are very high if you only fed this animal alfalfa from that sample that she showed us. So you can go back and you can say, okay, we know that we don't need this much protein and we're meeting the TDN requirements, but it might help to add a little bit of fiber like she mentioned. So now we can go over and add this grass to our example. And then you want to edit these back down to where she's meeting her intake requirements. And that's one. Okay, so now we're feeding a pound of grass and 2.3 pounds of alfalfa. You can see how these requirements change, right? So as you're going along, you can add different types of feed and you can make sure that you're balancing it where this all looks good for what she has for a requirement. And then you can go back towards the end of gestation and do the same thing. And obviously she's going to have higher requirements. And so you'll have to balance the ration that way. But this is how we can make sure that we're meeting all of her requirements without throwing money down the drain. So essentially at 2.3 pounds of alfalfa, you're giving her a lot of extra that she doesn't need as far as crude protein goes. So you can adjust all of that to fit your needs and make sure that you're meeting. So this tool is really handy. You can go through, you can, like I said, save these things so you can look back at them. It's a free tool. All you have to do is sign up with a login information, and you can go through and make sure that what you're feeding your animals is indeed meeting her requirements. One of the things that you have to be careful of then, which I'll get into in a second, is if you have animals that are gestating and animals that are lactating, you may want to consider splitting those animals up if it's possible, because they're going to have such different requirements during different periods of their gestation. So it's just something to think about there. Hopefully I went through and answered any questions that you guys have, but feel free to shoot them in the box and we can try to address them right here and now so that you guys can actually use this tool and be able to do something with it. I'm going to open, Anna, you had a question? You'll have to unmute yourself. Maybe she doesn't have a question. Okay, we'll go ahead and move on. So let me go back to my PowerPoint. Okay, so hopefully that gives you an idea of how to use the results that you'll get back when you send off for a feed analysis, and you'll be able to actually go ahead and balance those rations to where your animals are getting what they need. Again, though, I'm happy at any time to help balance rations for you. If you, especially anybody who's willing to get their feeds tested, it's great. That program also has an option to use averages for different feeds, so you don't have to get them tested. But like Rebecca talked about earlier, there's so much variation in feeds that, especially with the hay and that type of thing, it's really gonna do you the most good to have your feeds tested. So with that being said, I need to open this up. So with that being said, as you're purchasing feeds, you have every right to ask for a feed analysis before you purchase a feed. You especially do not want to purchase anything that has a weird color or texture or has a bunch of junk in it. These things can not only be bad for your animals, but it's also a big waste of your money, and the quality of the feed is probably not going to be very good. So even just upon visual evaluation, you can tell this feed is not something that I want to purchase. And again, Rebecca mentioned this as well, but you go and you buy hay and it looks really nice and green. Just because usually the more green it is, the better quality. Again, if you have something that's really stemmy, it's going to look nice and green, but it might not actually have that quality that you think it does just by looking at it. So, at the end of the day, you're going to save yourself as much money as you're going to spend getting these analyses done just because you did a good job purchasing the feed. Storage, she mentioned a lot of that as well, for the quality of feed, but also just for the sake of your animal's health and just not wasting your money on feed again. So one of the things, you keep things under a roof or under a tarp, keep the rain off of it. You want to keep it off the ground. One of the things that I have a lot of trouble with in my area are the voles. So if I keep my hay up off the ground on pallets or something, it keeps it from molding, it keeps the rodents from eating it away, and you don't lose as much to that. You want to protect your investments from other critters. So for example, cats and mice and other pests can actually, especially in sheep and goats, give you some disease problems, which if you go back to some of the webinars we've had before, there's more details on that. But it's certainly something to consider to keep all of those other pests and feces and that type of thing out of your feeds. And again, if you let other animals get in there, you're going to have some issues with feed shortages. And the last thing you need is to run out of feed in the end of February. You also want to be able to keep it away from your livestock, because one of the biggest ways to kill a sheep or a goat, as you well know, is to let them overindulge in something they should not. But also make sure that wherever you're putting your feed, you're going to be able to have access to it even in bad weather conditions. Just some considerations for feeding. If you do feed on the ground, try not to put it in the mud. Rotate to clean spots on the snow, or rotate throughout the field so that you have lower chances of disease and parasite spread through urine and feces where they may bed down in their feed. They're also going to waste a lot more if you put it on the ground. So if you're ground feeding, the best option there is to limit feed them to whatever their nutrient requirements are going to be. You can also provide it in feed bunks, and that's going to decrease that exchange of possible disease and parasite in the feeds themselves, because they aren't going to have a chance to stand and lay in that feed. Oh, sorry. You can also better evaluate the intake that they're actually eating versus maybe wasting, laying on, etc. So if you feed into a bunk, have a good understanding of how much you're actually giving them from a weight standpoint, and that'll help you understand why you may be seeing signs of obesity or animals getting skinny or whatever it may be. You have a better way of evaluating that. Some considerations on feeding, though, is if you are going to feed in bunks, you need to make sure that they have the appropriate spacing so that they're able to get enough feed, especially when you have issues with pecking order, or if you're just not giving them enough space. Some of them may not be getting enough feed, and some of them are probably getting too much feed. So make sure that you give them, ewes need up to 20 inches, especially when they have lambs on them, of lateral distance that they can eat. Rams need 12 and lambs need up to 12 as well. And that's if you're limit feeding to a certain amount of feed each day. You can obviously give them a little bit less space if you're letting them free choice eat all day long. But make sure when it gets really cold or the weather gets bad, increase the amount you're feeding them if you're limit feeding them, because they're gonna need that extra energy, especially at night, to get through that cold weather and maintain their body heat. And it never hurts to provide a little bit of bedding, some straw or something, so that they don't need as much from the nutrient standpoint to maintain that body heat. Finally, make sure that you provide enough water and thawed out water throughout the winter. So sheep and goats can drink up to 5 gallons a day. So make sure that you're having enough water available to them throughout the day for all the animals. And in the winter time, they're going to drink more if the water is a little bit warmer. So if there's any possibility to get that water at a higher temperature, you're going to have a better chance of making sure they drink enough. And that's really, really important, especially making sure they keep that intake up throughout the winter so they don't get thin on you. And also during lactating, they need a lot more water to make that milk. Make sure you provide clean water, clean out anything that could be building up and causing health issues. And also, one of the things that I find is that lambs and kids love to die in a water trough. So make sure that you have an ability to keep that from happening. These are all considerations that are much better to think about now when it's a little warmer than after it happens the first time and you're panicking in the icy months of the year. So again, going back to the different stages of animals, if at all possible, if you can separate out animals that need more nutrient requirements, it's going to be really important so that you don't have ewes or does with singles getting way more than they need and the ewes with triplets dropping weight because they just can't keep up. They can't eat enough because other animals are taking it from them. And you can also have more supplement available and save yourself a little bit of money if you're only supplementing the ones that really need it. So at the end of the day, take your average body weight and your average life stage and try to feed to that, but just make sure they have the space and make sure they're getting what they need so that you don't have any nutritional issues. And the last thing I will touch on, which we have talked about before, but if you're getting your feeds analyzed and you have some of the minerals coming back, then you can have a good idea of what your animals need, what you need to add, what you have too much of, and you can really avoid some of those really bad diseases and problems that can arise from unbalanced mineral options. But make sure you're always providing some white salt, and if at all possible, try to meet their mineral needs. And with that, and Rebecca, thank you so much for joining us. I love working with you, and I hope that this gets you an opportunity to work with some of the sheep and goat people, especially in Idaho, to send some salmon to you.
Thank you, Melinda. Always appreciate the opportunity, and it's always fun to work with sheep and goats, get a little break from the cattlemen for a minute, right?
Absolutely. All right, thanks guys. You guys take care till next week.